Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. We'll get started with the presentation. I know last week's feedback has been largely due to the fact that things were quite long, so I'm going to try to keep this stream a lot shorter and get more to the point and just, I guess, get through it. Thanks, Javier. Thanks for joining, bro. So I guess the main question that this 10-year plan seeks to answer is where to live as a Muslim in Sydney in particular. So I guess the question is first, a starting point would be, why do we live where we live? So it depends on how long is a piece of straw in terms of how you want to define that question. For some people, it's just convenience. Okay, my parents migrated here, they found a place here in Sydney and they sort of just started living here. For some people, it could be longer. So it could be like, okay, it's post-colonial, the fact that our countries were invaded, destroyed, etc. That forced a brain drain for the Muslim community. So the best of the talent went in search of economic interest overseas. They found better jobs, living opportunities for their families. And so that's why a lot of people left the Muslim world. So I guess that's another way of looking at it. But I guess the core question of is, like what this seeks to answer is, how can you change where you live or potentially adapt where you live to have better life outcomes, whether that's worldly or otherwise. It gets to the crux of it in terms of where you live, because where you live actually determines a lot of life outcomes. And I think that's something that sometimes people don't question. Most people sort of live and die in the same suburb that they were born in, or the house that they were born into. And I think given the stuff that's happened recently as well, in terms of the property market, the way that it's sort of gone up quite fast during COVID, low interest rates, etc. I think the topic of property purchase, etc. is on a lot of people's minds. And I guess the fact that there's more quote-unquote Islamic finance or home mortgaging options available, there's a lot of people that are sort of dabbling into this question now than they may have previously. So I guess the first question would be to everyone, I guess, that's watching is, why do you live where you live? And as I said, for some people it's purely financial. So I live in this suburb because the rent is cheap and affordable. Maybe it's because of work. So it's the commute to work is shorter. It could be a wide range of reasons. But I guess the idea should be that you live where you live, but is this where you should continue to live? Especially if you're going to consider raising a family here. Is that the best location for you to live in? So I'll get into it properly. So the 10-year plan that I've been sort of talking about, I'll give a little bit of a historical background to it. But I guess if you wanted to summarize its mission, the idea is that how do you socially engineer a better Muslim community? So there's a Muslim community. It has many issues that people seek to address. But can you help these issues by socially engineering where they live in terms of how that can sort of be a solution to these problems? So what I mean by socially engineering, for anyone that's sort of watched the previous video that I made about the hierarchy of deeds, the idea is that you change the variables, you can change your environment in a particular way that makes outcomes a lot easier for you. The example I gave that a lot of non-Muslims give is the guitar. So if you want to learn how to play the guitar, if it's in a case on a dusty shelf that you're going to really look at, you're not going to really play it, you're not going to become adept at sort of playing it. Whereas if you have it on a guitar stand next to your bed, you're more likely to play it. So like apply this to many other aspects of your life as a Muslim, I guess. So if you live next to a mosque or a musalla, the chances that you're going to pray in congregation are much higher. If you live closer to an Islamic school, the time that you're going to save in peak hour traffic, etc. would be easier. And there's many other examples that you can give. But the idea here is that you can change your social environment to impact your outcomes in life. So a lot of people sort of have this sort of binary of nature or nurture. But the idea here is that your sort of nurturing aspect can actually change. You can actually change a lot of the parts of your environment. It's not a fixed variable. Now, in terms of, I always put caveats at the beginning of these presentations. One aspect of it would be there's going to be constant issues with the data. So I'm using a lot of the data that I'm using is publicly available. It's published by the government. So there's naturally underlying issues with the data. So people may not fill out the census, which limits its ability, but more or less because there's fines and stuff, people fill it out. The other aspect of underlying data would be stuff like, okay, when I look at crime rates, for example, um, is there like an institutionalized racism when it comes to how data is collected about criminals from particular minority backgrounds as opposed to other backgrounds? Another issue with the underlying data might be, do people underreport? So when people fill out the census, do they actually fill out the correct details, or do they hide the fact that they're Muslim or something like that? Which, when I speak to a lot of community leaders, they think that the numbers are actually underreported, for example. Then it comes to another issue is data changes. So the idea is that all these data points that I'm collecting are point in time. So naturally things change, and so the data may be outdated. But what I've done is to sort of deal with that issue is I've used the most up-to-date data, and I was waiting quite intently for the latest census data to be released. So the census was held, I think it's held every 5 years. It was held last year, and the data had been available to the public recently. So that's another aspect of it. The other aspect of it is the fact that there's a lot of, these are sensitive topics. So when I talk about, for example, crime rates or something like that, or how a particular suburb can be positioned, some people obviously that may live in that suburb may find it offensive or anything like that. So that's obviously not the intent, but the idea here is that how do we sort of objectively measure suburbs against one another? So for example, I was talking to a brother on my Instagram inbox about, is Maryland's overreported? Like, is there like a racial bias of cops towards people that live around Marylands, etc.? But I said that, like, obviously there's issues and the data's not perfect, but like if you compare Marylands to say another suburb that has this as many racially diverse or minority background people, you don't see the same level of crime. So yes, Maryland, all things being equal, ceteris paribus, is maybe a worse suburb to sort of live in. And so I think like when I use words like this is a bad suburb, or this is a good suburb, because those are loaded terms, it does sort of hit on people's nerves, so it could be a sensitive issue. So just in terms of people being, just a heads up about that. Another issue is conflict of interest. So naturally that like there might be, as any person that's researching or anything like that, you may have inherent biases. So confirmation biases or any other type of biases, or conflict of interest where you perhaps think that this suburb is going to be good because you already have a property there, or someone in your family does, etc. So there's these inherent biases that come about. Same thing with Islamic schools. So you might, like people might say, okay, you have particular ties to these particular schools. That's why you're sort of preferencing them. But what I'm trying to do is sort of remove or decouple the personal interests, etc., and just looking at data and what that sort of says. And as I say in every presentation, do your own research. So the idea is that I could be a spinner just making up these things. So I've put all the references and stuff as I go through. But yeah, do your own research. Don't like make major financial decisions, or this isn't financial advice or anything like that. So there's all those typical caveats. But if you do your own research, you obviously sort of come to this. So this is just like guiding or structuring the own research that I've done and presenting it to people so they can save time, I guess. So what's the background with the 10-year plan? It's a good place to start, because my journey, I guess, through life shapes the way I sort of look at the world, and suburbs in particular. And obviously everyone has a different lived experience, so people might have different views on this. But I guess starting off, because I lived in a vastly, like a majority background suburb of when it comes to Muslims, I have a particular sort of insulated worldview of the wider community. So people like, say, I think Habil, if you're still watching, because you perhaps have lived more towards the CBD, etc., you might sort of have a different worldview that's less insulated from the wider community. So I guess the idea here is that that's where I started. So that's sort of like Greenacre, Lakemba sort of area where there's heaps of Muslims. So when you sort of like when you interact with non-Muslims, it's a little bit more awkward than, say, someone that's been accustomed to dealing with them. The reason I sort of put this pendulum on the right-hand side as a visualization is like my view has changed in terms of, should we live near Muslims, should you move away from Muslims, and all these other things, and I'll come to that in a sec. So after that, like you sort of go to university, and then you sort of like realize the degenerate aspects of non-Muslims. So the fact that they party, they take drugs, they sort of have a very different worldview. They may not be they may not associate with the gender that they're born into, and all these other things that you see at, say, UCID or something like that. So when I went to university, like I was really shell-shocked because I had been insulated for so long. And so that was another aspect of it. So I went towards the pendulum where it's like, okay, I need to stay within the local Muslim community, those particular hubs in the southwest of Sydney. But then what happened is, the point three is sort of where things started changing, where the pendulum started shifting to the other side, and that was when I sort of started working in the corporate world. So I worked for a few years in Chatswood, and I saw, okay, the trains come every 3 minutes, there's the metro, it's clean, there's low crime, the kids seem like generally like involved, they're always studying at the library, for example. I used to hang out at the library for a bit. So the idea here is that like when I sort of moved out of the area significantly, so like on the other side of the Harbour Bridge, etc., I sort of came to a realization that there's a whole different world where there's people that are doing well. They're sort of dedicated to the work, life, the environment seems relatively better, the infrastructure is stronger. And so I started to think of the 10-year plan. So this was, I'd say maybe 2018, maybe 2017, I can't remember if I'm getting my dates mixed up, but that's when I sort of conceived of the 10-year plan. So I guess like the reason I said 10 years is it's going to take a long time. As to whether it can happen in 10 years, so whether this could happen by, I don't know, 2027 or 2028 or something like that, that's all yet to be determined. I guess it's largely contingent upon a lot of economic factors. But the idea here is that I was exposed to a world where there was better infrastructure, and I was like, hey, wouldn't it be great if you had something like, say, Greenacre or Lakemba, but you had the infrastructure of Chatswood? It'd be amazing. And then I guess what happened is that like when you have kids and stuff, you realize that the infrastructure in the community is in particular really bad. So despite the fact that like most of the kids that are being sort of born, etc., in Southwest Sydney, if you look at things like the hospitals, the daycare centres, the schools, they're not the best. Yes, there's obviously outliers here and there, but like in my local vicinity, there's Canterbury Hospital, Bankstown Hospital, Auburn Hospital. Now I know Auburn Hospital, I think I've been told from like a birthing perspective is okay, but like every person, like with my kids and everyone that I sort of acquaint with, I always told them, if you're going to have kids, go to RPA. Yes, it's next to UCID and there's like a drive down Parramatta Road and the rest of it. And there's like risk associated with whether you'll get there in time. But because obviously a pregnancy or sort of like the delivery part of it, labour goes for many hours, so you could probably make it. But the idea here is that why would I felt really odd that I had to drive all the way to RPA to go to a hospital for my children to be born, because I don't trust the Bankstown Hospital. We probably all have heard of or experienced really bad service there. Emergency is terrible, wait times terrible. It's obviously always a political pawn, like Labour and Liberal are always debating like, oh yeah, we're going to help this community. I think they've announced like this big refunding thing for Canterbury Hospital, but like you'll see it when you see it. And so the idea here is that if you look at these infrastructure, if you look at the train lines, the Bankstown train line is the worst. Constant delays, there's no contingencies, so like if something happens, it's not like the other train lines where you have like parallel train lines that you can sort of still get past it and all these other things. So like if you consider everything from that perspective, you start realizing that you have to go out of the area for services for your kids. So for example, for daycare, for OT, speech therapy, etc., that I use for my son, for example, they're all out of area. So the idea here is that there's much better services objectively outside of the area, and whether it's a political issue or economic issue or whatever, there's those issues that like you can't sort of circumvent. You can't sort of like build your own hospital. You can't improve the train line. It's like beyond one person or a community's obligation to do that. So that's where like the pendulum swung in the way that I'm started thinking, okay, what if we could move out of the area? What if you could move to Chatswood, or what if you could move to like St. Ives or these other good suburbs that are objectively better? But then like the pendulum swings back because you sort of are fearful of the Islamic influence. So like if your kids grow up in a particular suburb where there's very few Muslims, you're the only brown kid, you're the only kid that's not celebrating Christmas or Easter or anything like that, you're already ostracized. If your mom's the only one that's wearing the hijab for pick up and drop off, I thought about it from my kids' perspective. I'm like, okay, do I want them to feel alienated? Do I want them to feel otherized? And so that's where I started thinking, I'm like, okay, hold the phone here. It's not just about the worldly aspects. It's not only about those things, but it's about also preservation of the Islamic identity. So like there's this thing that I was listening to Sheikh Shadi mention, like when you sort of talk about like migrant parents, like they can say, okay, my kids will stay Muslim, but then the second generation, there's huge risk that they will sort of be misguided or be led off the path. And I guess inevitably our religion also tells us that you have to stick to the congregation. Shaitan preys upon like a group or an individual, that strays away from the group, like a wolf will attack a sheep that moves away from the herd. So there's a very clear concept here that like you need to maintain an Islamic identity, and the only way that you can do that is by or the way that you mitigate for risk is by sort of staying close to a Muslim community. So I think that's very important. And I think the other thing that I've come to, and a lot of people that sort of look into demographics and sociological aspects of like Sydney, you come to the conclusion that there's two cities. You know, the tale of two towns or something like that. Like the idea here is that there's everything west of the Red Rooster line. So there's like Western Sydney, which stretches from like, let's just say roughly like say the inner west, so like Ashfield, Canterbury, etc., all the way down to like where the new developments are happening. All of that is very different to everything east. So the eastern suburbs, the northern suburbs, etc. That's completely a different part of Sydney from an infrastructure, from a schooling perspective, etc. So there's all these particular aspects that are really important. So looking at the context of Muslims in Australia, it's important to note like the fact that it's increasing. So this is looking at like the census data over the last couple of decades. I guess this is like my lifetime. So like I guess around the time that I was born, there was only about 200,000 Muslims, and like the last census that was done, that's like quadrupled to 800,000. And like if you just follow laws of trajectory, like you'll realize that this number is going to continue to increase. So like I think by the next census, which is in 2026, the Muslim population will be or surpass 1 million. So out of the non-Christian affiliated religions, Islam is obviously the highest. Hinduism is obviously increasing because of migration patterns from India and stuff. But you start realizing that like we're a sizable part of the population, and so there is a market here that can be sort of disrupted. So this was the research method that I took. So I went through all these 8 steps. Currently, I'm still up to about 6 and 7, and I guess like I'd be more than happy to sort of partner with any like universities or anything that would find this data useful. I genuinely think that I've made a contribution to the literature or whatever you want to call it, because I've basically used VLOOKUPs and stuff like that to sort of merge different databases which are generally presented in isolation, so that people can sort of view them collectively. So so my presentation is basically these steps, if you want to think of a contents page. So the first part of it would be, what's the problem? And like, I know this is a lot of text and a lot of things, I'll sort of work through this diagram. Basically, the idea is that like most of the Muslim community are located in sub-average suburbs, and there's many metrics I'll show that sort of indicate upon that. And if you just follow the diagram, this sort of explains the process. So what happens is there's an initial migration of Muslims. So like when you think of Muslims in obviously you can go all the way back to the first interactions with the indigenous people. Then you can fast forward to the Cameleers after like European sort of like colonization of Australia and stuff like that. Then you have like, if you fast forward further, then you've got like about the 1970s, etc., where this number starts increasing because of, I guess, the civil war in Lebanon, and a lot of migration comes from there. And then like in the 80s and 90s, like in the second half of that 20th century, Australia moves away from the white Australian policy. You have more and more sort of people coming from the Middle East and Asia and parts of Africa. So I guess the idea here is that there's an increase in migration, and that initial migration settles in different pockets. So like in Melbourne, it will be a different pocket. In Sydney, it was generally around, say, Lakemba, for example. Then what happens is like there's particular infrastructure that's built, primarily the masjid. So when Lakemba Mosque, obviously it was a house, and they demolished it, built it, etc., around the 70s, that becomes like the first major beacon of Islam. And then obviously you have developments in other parts, Auburn Gallipoli Mosque, etc. But the idea here is that once you build those core infrastructure parts of a masjid, what happens is that everything sort of starts sort of building around it. So the halal food, the Islamic schools, etc., those will start sort of popping up in and around those particular areas. Then what happens is that because the infrastructure is present, those suburbs become Muslim friendly. So everyone knows like Lakemba or Auburn as like Muslim suburbs, for example, just as like any other cultural cluster. So like Cabramatta is like Vietnamese orientated, and there's many other examples you can give. But the idea here is that those minorities cluster together, which is only natural, like in-group biases will happen. And then what happens is that because they've built the infrastructure, or the fact that those particular suburbs are orientated towards this community, subsequent migrants that come move into those particular suburbs, and the children of the first migration also start living in those suburbs. So this is where like you build a granny flat, or you sort of live with your parents or whatever happens. But then even after you sort of may get married and leave the house, you still want to live close to your parents. And because they are sort of anchored to those particular suburbs, then naturally you sort of gravitate towards being within like a 2 or 5 kilometer radius of those suburbs. So that's just sort of like the natural progression. So the idea here is that those first generation Muslims settled in lower SES suburbs. So the idea here is that like the eastern suburbs, etc., have always been financially more expensive, less sort of accessible for people that obviously migrants, people that may not know English, may not have jobs, and all these other things that come with sort of being a new arrival at the country. The idea here is that they obviously work, and they work quite hard, so that their children can obviously go to school and get an education and sort of build upon the sort of foundations that they've built. And then what happens is, nevertheless, there's a vicious cycle, or virtuous cycle, if you want to call it that, of people continuing to sort of live there because the infrastructure is already built. Then what happens is like an issue that happens for younger Muslims, I guess by younger I'm sort of talking about, I don't know what young is nowadays, but let's just say people in like say their 20s, their 30s, maybe their early 40s, they sort of can now afford to move into better suburbs. So the reason for that is because they're second or third generation, they do have more income. They are more educated, and that this is for a reason, a list of reasons. So what I've listed here is like, because they most likely graduated from university, unlike their parents, they might have higher income yielding jobs because they may have inherited wealth. So let's just say that their parents started a mixed business that sells, I don't know, nuts and other stuff. And they sort of inherit those businesses, or the wealth that came with those businesses. And obviously, because the community is larger, so the earning capacities are higher. So like, for example, if you, I don't know, open up a new business that sells, I don't know, halal meat or something like that, because the community is larger, you have a bigger market to sort of earn income with, versus say, like if you rewind, like if you went back in history, like 20, 30 years, and the Muslim population was less than 200,000 across Australia. The other aspect of it is the reason that people can afford, the next generation, or the younger generation of Muslims can afford more is because there's more Sharia compliant mortgages. So you have like MCCA, ICFAL, and then you've got the forced multipliers, and I'll probably do a separate like a recording or session on this. So you've got like Mizan, Ijara, Hijaz, and Amana, for example. And you've got this market of growing basically third-party providers. So you've got the top tier and the rest of it. But the idea is that because more sheikhs and more people are sort of becoming more sort of open to the idea of finance, sort of debt financing. So the idea that you go into this contract, etc. Now, obviously, you still have people in the community, and I'm still on the fence about this. I'll sort of share my final thoughts on where I land. I'm working closely with another brother who's also researching this topic in terms of whether these Sharia compliant options are actually Sharia compliant. But like, until I sort of cast my judgment or sort of fall on one side of the fence, the idea, I'm not sort of making a moral judgment on anyone. I'm just saying that more people are open to the idea of debt financing because you have these options. I'm not necessarily saying that those options are correct or wrong or correct or otherwise. I'm just saying that the options exist. So there's guilt-free finance options. So previously, say the first generation that came here, they were sort of, there wasn't access to ICFA or MCC and all these other things. And especially with ICFA, because it's, MCC also when it started, because they're cooperatives, so like the sort of members are sort of funding other members. The idea here is that those funds wouldn't be readily available as they are, say, now. So the idea here is that there were less financing options, and there was also more guilt associated with it. So more people would say that, okay, it's riba, it's haram, no matter what you call it. And I guess there's been a cognitive shift in that, and there's more options. So there's more chances for people to move out of the area because they can afford properties that are a bit more expensive. However, as I said, that moving to a better suburb doesn't mean that your kids will stay upon Islam, and I've sort of talked about the importance of sticking to the congregation, and I've also spoken about how, like, if you don't want to live in a suburb where you sort of have to keep constantly like explaining your Islam to people, like, and I think like sending my son to a daycare center that's out of area really exposed me to this. So what I mean by that is telling them that, okay, I don't want him to do Christmas carols, I don't want him to be, I don't want him to eat bacon for breakfast. And like because there's only like one or two other Muslim kids, it's not something that they're sort of accustomed with. And so it's sort of like a double-edged sword that yes, you get better teachers, better facilities, better policies and procedures, etc. At that particular daycare. But then you have to sort of trip over yourself to explain your Islam to people. And it's just a cognitive load that you can't be bothered with. Like, do you really have to explain that you can't shake hands and the fact that you have to pray and all this other stuff, where if you live in a suburb where there's a dominance or a sort of large number of Muslims, people just know, okay, we don't shake hands, or we, for example, need to pray or have halal food or all these other things. So you don't become like an exception or outlier in that sense, especially if there's a core group of people. So what ends up happening, just coming back to the diagram then, is that because those Muslim suburbs are more friendly towards Muslims, what ends up happening is that those suburbs become more expensive. And like if you look at, say, Greenacre, for example, during the height of the market, a simple house on like 500, 600 square meters, like the run rate that I calculated was it's about 2,200 per square meter. So I don't know, if you've got like a 500 square meter house, during the peak of the property boom, it was about maybe 1.4 million or something like that, assuming that it's not renovated or anything, just like a simple normal house. So what ends up happening is then that like people have to think from a financial perspective, do I downsize? So do I move into a unit? Then there's urban sprawl, which is the second option down at the bottom of the diagram, which is, okay, do I sort of move out? So do I move towards Austral? Do I move towards like Liverpool? Or do I move towards Badgerys Creek where the new airport's going to be built? Do I move out and live in those particular suburbs because it's cheaper? So you buy a land and house package or something like that, or you just buy land and then you build later. But the idea is that do you move out because it's cheaper? Obviously that then comes with foregoing the infrastructure and all these other things that are sort of established in other suburbs. And then you've got the 10-year plan. So the way I'm sort of presenting the 10-year plan as a solution to this particular problem that we're facing is that what if you had something that was relatively affordable and was in still a good suburb? So this is a property development idea at the core of it. Like there's a research part of it, but then at the end of it, it's sort of going to be like whether rubber hits the road, or is that you would need to either have one of two models that I've sort of been exploring with a few people. One is if you go out west, you're going to have to basically purchase a large block of land and do a development where you sort of subdivide it and sort of have your own community sort of built. And then you can sort of like, it's sort of like Age of Empires. You've got like this acreage and you say, okay, the masjid is going to go here and the streets are going to be divided this way and there'll be houses here, etc., etc. The alternative path for property development here in Sydney would be to sort of do like not a high rise, but sort of like maybe between an 8 and a 12 level building. So the idea here would be a block of units or flats. In there you would have like segregated gyms, maybe a pool. You would have a masjid. So obviously from a perspective, ideally the masjid would be on the top level. And so what will happen then is like, imagine you've got like a gated community. So even with the urban sprawl idea, it would be like there's like a gated community, like it's a closed off fence and people sort of can buy into it. Like obviously there's like jokes around it becoming a cult and stuff, but the idea here is that you would have maybe a high-rise building, and if you go to like the new developments in Burwood, so just go to Burwood, look at the tallest building, go there, and it's next to the Masonic Centre. You'll notice that there's just two big towers. You've got a big sort of open area of like a small park in the middle, and then you've got like it's just gated, high walls. Even like the postman has to sort of get a special key so that you can put letters into people's boxes. That's sort of like the idea. That imagine you had a building, all your neighbours were Muslim, everything was like that. Now obviously I'm sort of selling it as like a utopian dream, but the idea here is that you would want to sort of insulate that place from the outer world, at least in the confines of the residents, because obviously like what we're seeing with like what's happening in the outside world in terms of different ideas and things that are being pushed, you do need a degree of insulation from that. Now what the second step is, you obviously don't just start researching, you actually look at what exists already. So what I did is I looked into the different articles that have been written on the best place. So I searched literally best Sydney suburbs to raise a family. And what obviously this is like non-Muslims doing this research, so they wouldn't have the added part that I'm sort of adding to this. But the idea would be that I use this to sort of become familiar with what are the variables that they use to determine what a good suburb is. And I've put this into my own criteria that I'll share shortly. Then the idea here would be that when you look at those 9 articles, some suburbs are repeatedly mentioned. So I didn't count any suburb that's only mentioned once out of the 9 articles, but you have like some suburbs that are mentioned a couple of times, some suburbs that were mentioned 3, 4, and 5 times. So those suburbs I've sort of put on a map in one of the slides that are coming up. But you see like Lane Cove, Waverley, if they're appearing 5 times out of 9 articles, they're probably really good suburbs to raise a family in. So it's not like colluding or something. Like these are independent, different sort of people that have written these articles, and they've sort of come to these conclusions. Then on the right hand side of the slide, I've just got the Muslim case studies that already exist. So what I mean by case studies is these are sort of like pockets of Muslims that are living away from the area. So you had Indonesians in DY, the Bengalis in East Lakes. There's a mixed group of people living in Wollongong. So I know there's some Lebanese and some other cultures living down there. And you've got this like new thing that's happening, relatively new thing that's happening in Young, where a lot of people from a Lebanese background are sort of moving over there. Now, what I've done is I've actually spoken to people that sort of have lived there, or are children of people that have lived there, etc., just to sort of get an idea of like the pros and the cons and like their experience. And obviously, the idea here is to learn from maybe the experience of others. So things didn't go right. What were those particular things? How can, if we were to do this, how can we sort of avoid it? So I guess like the Indonesians in DY, for example, so there's DY Masjid that's still there, but I guess like the summary of the conversations I've had would be the fact that it just became too expensive. Like living around DY and those sort of northern beaches areas, the property prices have increased significantly. So the children that want to live near their parents or live near where they sort of spent their childhood is financially impossible. So they have to obviously move to the area or move elsewhere. Then with the Bengalis in East Lake, so these are like a lot of their kids went to like those like Sydney Boys and all of those ones. I find again for them a lot of it is financial. So what's happening here is that those people are sort of, a lot of them are selling out. So selling property that they own in East Lake. So if anyone that doesn't know East Lakes, it's like in the eastern suburbs. And what they're doing is now they're sort of moving towards like the Minto, Campbelltown area. So that's happening as well. Then you've got the Wollongong one. So when I speak to people like Sheikh Nassim and people that sort of do go down there frequently, the idea there is that like it's a bit of a lost case. There's a lot of families down there that have moved there for economic reasons and stuff, but they haven't maintained Islamic identity. They've sort of been melted into like white Australia. So what I'm talking about here is that they're very mentally their adherence to Islam, etc., is being whitewashed. So that's like a good example where you don't want to just like move somewhere for the sake of it, but you want to sort of consider the infrastructure that you would need before you do so. And then like with the people that have moved to Young, so this is a bit of like a mixed bag. So a lot of people say it's like, it sounds good, it didn't work. Like most of the people that I've spoken to feel that way. So what I mean by that is that there's nothing there, there's no infrastructure, it's boring, the shopping centre is boring, there's nothing really to do there. So people go there for an escape, but the escapism like fades after a bit of time and they sort of inevitably come back. So I've got a neighbour, for example, that did the same thing, and like he's back here like every few days, and I'm sort of like, what was the point of moving down if you're going to come back so often? So there's all these sort of variables to consider as well. So if you want to go rural, Young is a good example of people moving rural. If you want to go south coast, Wollongong is a good example. North, DY, and east is East Lakes. So like these things have occurred, like if that makes sense. So it's not like we're starting from scratch. We can sort of build upon a foundation that's been built. And as I mentioned, like they're not without their issues. Then if you look at non-Muslim examples, you've got Eastwood. So we actually got like my data set here. I'm just looking at my other screen. Eastwood is a crazy example of how things changed like this is a good 10-year plan example. Like another good example of the 10-year plan are the Christian Lebanese in Mount Lewis. So if you look at Mount Lewis, for example, they built the school, the church, the aged care facility, and now that suburb is like those surrounded by like Muslim suburbs. Like Mount Lewis is a good example of like a 10-year plan where like people have thought, they're like, okay, we need to build infrastructure. Let's all move to the same area, and you can see that population demographics changing as well. What's interesting to know is that when you look at the example of Eastwood, the question about ancestry was introduced in 2011. So as I said, like the census happens every year. What's publicly available, I think, is from 2001 data. So if you look at like Eastwood, from 2011, the percentage of people that were Chinese was 30%. and in the last census, it's 50%. So I'll just spend a little bit of time about this because like I'm trying to paint a picture of like how the 10-year plan is actually impactful. So I've given the example of the Lebanese Christians in Mount Lewis. Let's just look at Eastwood. So again, Eastwood is like near that whole Macquarie Park area. The idea here is that like I was told by people that live there that like people, like literally people would knock on your door and try to buy your house above the market rate. And that's a good example of like just people saying, okay, this is our suburb, let's just buy all the houses and like live next to each other. So as I said, they went from 30% to about 50% of the population. In terms of numbers, they've gone from about 5,000 to over 9,000, just in a span of like 10 years, which is pretty crazy when you consider everything. And like the impact on that is like the public schools. So I like every weekend I go to like different parts of Sydney that when I'm researching just to sort of get a vibe of the suburb. Like, is this the suburb? And then I do the shopping centre around and everything just to sort of figure out, okay, can I see my family living here? So I went to Eastwood just as a thing because one of my friends, Ehsan, kept telling me, oh, bro, it's a good suburb. So when I went there, I realised that it's like really, really chock-a-block full of people from Southeast Asia and East Asia. And then like to the extent that the signs at the school, so these are government schools, public schools, the signs like will say like, teachers car park, no entry, and then underneath it will have the same thing in Chinese, in Mandarin. And so like, and they've got these, I think it was the Feng Shui or the Shaolin schools. So I think in Sydney there's about 4 or 5, and Eastwood, I think Kent Road, etc. Those are schools that have like this additional stuff about like Chinese culture and language. So you can see how like, despite sort of like it being a government school or something that shouldn't be like, that is open for the whole community, because the community is predominantly one particular demographic, the school itself changes according to them, and so on and so forth. Like I think there's like for example in America, there's particular schools that like the days of Eid for Muslims is like a day off school for everyone. So like those are like some good examples I'm sort of trying to give of like the idea that once you cluster and you do it effectively, you can sort of have these second order benefits. Obviously, I haven't looked at the academic papers and I'm still deep diving into the case study. So like most things, this is a work in progress. So I'll just keep moving on. If there's any questions, feel free to chuck them in the chat. Okay, now for the research questions themselves. So I put 3 questions, and the first question is the main question. If money was not a constraint, which Sydney suburb would be the best Islamically and otherwise to raise a young family in? So the idea here is that firstly it's Sydney, and I'll explain why it's Sydney. I'm looking at the suburb level, and I'll explain why in a second as well. But when I'm saying best, like I'm not necessarily saying that there's going to be one suburb that's going to come head and shoulders above everyone else. It's also on a spectrum, and also depends on what you think is important for your family. And when I'm talking about young family is like, it's obviously different. Like if you're like a retired couple that have kids, that's still a Muslim family, but you're not a young Muslim family. So here I'm talking about things more like considerations around like daycares, primary schools, high schools, etc., and families, and the fact that they're Muslim as opposed to anything else. So I started off with hypotheses for all these questions as well. So like it's sort of like, okay, what would my guess be? And this would either be proven correct or incorrect through research. So for me, initially, it was like that in the Westmead to Ashfield corridor. So this is like, and I'll show this in a map in a second, basically north of the M4 and south of the Red Rooster line. And I'll talk about Red Rooster line in a second as well. Then what I've done is there's like secondary questions. So in the first question, the main point is that money is not a constraint. And so like this is sort of like in an ideal world where people had millions of dollars to spend, what would be the solution? And then the second part is like the fact that there's an acknowledgement that in reality, not everyone has that money. So if money was a constraint, what would be the cheaper alternatives of this particular plan? And I've sort of put a particular hypothesis around the fact that people would either have to downsize to units or sort of buy land and house packages near the new airport. What about the lessons from Muslims living outside of Sydney? So like this is the idea that the research is like very specific to do with Sydney. But if there's Muslims in, say, Melbourne or other parts of Australia, other capital cities, what are the particular things that they can take from this presentation and maybe adapt for them? And the hypothesis there would be that you need to find a Muslim community that's the central point and then expand based off SES centers. So that's similar to what I'm doing here, that I'm sort of like saying that, okay, where are the Muslims located? And because you need to be located near Muslims and mosques, etc., what is the sort of best suburb adjacent to those particular suburbs from an SES background or from an economic perspective. So these are some of the macro questions. The other thing is that I've been speaking to some Muslims that are sort of trying to lobby for government at a state and federal level. And another sort of variable that you can throw onto this is like, what are the electorates? Like if we're thinking very strategically and people sort of view that it's permissible to vote in elections and all these other caveats I can give, the idea would be, how do you sort of stack particular electorates to basically shape government? So we all know in the latest federal election, you have like these swing seats, or you have these seats that are not Labour or Liberal safe seats. And so effectively, even though there's 150 electorates, there's only like a handful of electorates that actually matter in the election. So would it make sense for Muslims to basically stack their votes and move into those suburbs, because they'll yield more power when it comes to being able to hold their minister for state or federal parliaments accountable, etc. So that's maybe just a more forward-looking question, I guess, but I haven't made that core of this particular research piece. Now, when I sort of like looked at my initial assumptions around how I view Sydney, this is how it is. So let's start off with the Red Rooster Line, because I think that's probably the most important part when you're sort of looking at Sydney. So the Red Rooster Line is known, so if you go onto like websites, property websites like Domain and all these other things, you'll see articles about this. But the idea here is that Sydney is divided into two parts. You have eastern North Sydney and south/west Sydney. And the thing that sort of determines where you sit in the pecking order in terms of Sydney is the Red Rooster Line. So basically what someone's done is they've plotted where the franchises of Red Rooster exist. And then if you're on the eastern side of where they exist, that means you're in a more expensive, more well-developed part of Sydney. And if you live on the west of that, it's different. So you can research this phenomenon, and it's like well known. So the idea then would be that, okay, anything to the east would be too expensive. Then if you look at the west, you can sort of subdivide that a little bit. So like there's a part of being west that is too west for me. So like if you're living in Whoop Whoop, if you're living in like Badgerys Creek or something like that, arguably that's too far. Obviously with the new airport coming and stuff, that might change. But the idea is that that's very far from, say, where your parents live, where the infrastructure is, where the CBD is, where employment is, where universities are, etc. Then what you've got is to the south, you've got like parts that are a bit too racist. So we obviously know the Cronulla riots and all these other things. But like once you go like into the Shire, Sutherland Council, etc., you're really far away from the centre of the Muslim community, and so you're going to be alienated there as well. Then I've got this like trapezium sort of green shape here in the middle, which I call two area. So what I mean by that is, I'm not saying it's a ghetto, but like it's sort of like an area where the infrastructure is weak, the hospitals are poor, and all these other things, and there's a lot of crime, and I'll sort of come to that in a second as well. So what I've done here is this was my initial view, and funnily enough, this has been really challenged. So I don't actually see many of these things existing the way I saw previously, and I'll explain why. So what I then did is I populated these dots. So if you remember when I looked at the existing articles on where are the best suburbs to raise families from a non-Muslim perspective, these were the suburbs that came out on top. So I've put like Glebe and Lane Cove and all these, Waverley, those suburbs that came up multiple times, I've put them in dark green. And then the suburbs that came up less frequently, I've put in light green. And then I've put the ones that appeared twice in orange. So again, you can see here that there is a large clustering here when it comes to being east of the Red Rooster Line. And I think that sort of confirms the fact that Sydney is two cities. So there's that question. So the reason that the current hypothesis that sort of highlighted green area in the middle is that particular corridor is because you want to be next to the area, but you want to move towards the Red Rooster Line. And that's why that sort of colouring came about. So let's look at the criteria. So what I'll do is I'll just move myself onto the other side of the screen. Everyone knows that just means methodology. So I'm into the fourth step, which is like the sampling, study size and stuff like that. So this is just like technical stuff, so I'll cover it quickly. Basically, the study design is an observational study. They're just sort of like observing what's happening. There's like different methodologies and stuff for research, so I'm just covering this quickly. And the idea is that like it'd be cross-sectional and analytical. The sample size is non-probability, so it's not like a scientific study, so I'm not doing something that's like otherwise. It's mainly convenience sampling, so like I'm just talking to people and researching that way. Now, there's another question that comes about in terms of like, why Sydney? And I think it's worth answering that question before I get into the criteria. So firstly, so the data sources, like if I don't have a reference there already, it's largely the ABS, so the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and the census data that came out in 2021. Firstly, New South Wales has the highest number of Muslims and concentration of Muslims in Australia. So if you compare it to Victoria, etc., it's significantly different. So put differently, 43% of Muslims that live in Australia live in New South Wales. So remember we said it's about 800k at the moment based off the last census. So 350k of that lives in New South Wales. And then obviously within New South Wales, the way that the population is structured is that Sydney is where most of those people live. And also Sydney has the most established Muslim institutions and resources. So it doesn't make sense for, again, Muslims to set up a rural thing away from existing infrastructure. And I guess the other idea is that Sydney is the most expensive option. So what I'm trying to say here is that if Muslims could come up with a solution that's affordable, etc., for people in Sydney, then I guess people in other parts of Sydney can do just as well. So there's that. Now, when it comes to, so that hopefully answers why Sydney. Now, in terms of nevertheless, as I said, in terms of the research question, the third question is like, to what extent can some of these conclusions be generalized to parts of Melbourne, or how can I redo this for people in Melbourne or other parts of Australia? But the idea is that it's obviously Sydney focused. The idea is that if you don't have a focus scope, then you're just going to sort of like spread yourself too thin. So it's just more time effective to just focus on a particular area. Now, when it comes to the criteria, so there are 5 things, and then affordability, like I said, because the first question is that if money was no question, where would Muslims live? And so affordability is like a second order question. The 5 criteria would be Islam, safety, amenities / infrastructure, property, and people. So I'm looking at the right hand side of the slide at the moment. The idea here is that this has weighting as well. So for example, just because a suburb has, I don't know, great infrastructure, it doesn't mean Muslims should live there. And this is the part of the research where it's more like adaptive. So, for example, I might care more about Islam or less about Islam than someone else. And so they might change the Islam weighting to say 60%, or someone else might change it to 40%. So the idea here is that like these are just weightings I've put, and obviously people would be different in terms of how they approach it. So what I'm trying to say here is this is my criteria. You can take the same research and apply your own criteria and change the variables. Perhaps you don't have kids and you don't intend to have kids for the next few years, so maybe you might not care about Muslim schools. So like what I'm trying to say is that it's like highly adaptable for people. But if we were to just have a criteria for the sake of having a criteria to be able to judge suburbs, then it would be that Islam would be 50% of the weighting. And when we talk about Islam, we're talking about 5 key areas, which I've sort of boiled down mainly into three things. But you've got the percentage of Muslims, you've got the number of mosques and centers, so like core infrastructure that people need for prayers and other things. And then you've got the Muslim schools, assuming that you prefer that, and I'll sort of talk about that towards the end of the presentation. Then you've got the degree of anti-Muslim sentiment, Islamophobic attack. So for example, like I said, you probably don't want to live around Cronulla and stuff like, yes, it's been like a decade or two since the whole thing happened, but like the idea here is that those like racial undertones and stuff that exist in some parts of Sydney are much greater than others. Then you've got halal food, and you've got segregated gyms. And like obviously you can make a laundry list of more things, but like I guess people always be like, you want halal food, and you want somewhere to send your kids, and you want to be able to pray somewhere. So those are like the main core aspects of how a Muslim would sort of judge a suburb. Then secondly, you've got crime. So you've got safety. So safety is sort of like measured by different metrics. So it can be heavily focused on things like crime, so crime rates and rankings and stuff. Other sort of secondary issues would be like things like pollution, flood and fire risk. So obviously, like if you live near like from the downstream of Warragamba Dam, and they like they don't change anything and floods keep happening, you probably don't want to live there. Same thing with bushfires. Like if bushfires keep getting bad, and you probably don't want to live around those particular areas. So the idea is that you'd consider those as well. You look at temperature, so there's like some reports in terms of the fact that like the way that climate change is going, like particular parts of Sydney, like Western Sydney, will become like very, very hot in summer. So we're talking about like 40 degrees plus and all these other things. So that might be a consideration. And that's also largely due to the fact of like how much of a sea breeze you face, how much concrete there is, how many roads there are, versus like natural trees and all these other things that sort of curb temperature. And then you've got the police command. So you've got local commands. Some police, like some local areas are more crime prone and have more racist police, perhaps, or all these other things. So these are things that you would want to consider from a safety perspective. And then you've got amenities and infrastructure. And so here you're looking at the core things that you need: hospitals, childcare, schools, etc. Even the extent of the NBN, like obviously these are like second order considerations that have less weighting, but like if you've got two suburbs that are exactly the same, but one has like fiber to the node and another one doesn't, then like you would want better internet. Likewise, transport roads, play areas, parks, water parks, shops, cafes. Again, like if these are like in walking distance of you, and you've got a library, you've got all these other things, you're socially engineering a life where like it's much more likely that your kid's going to go to the library and study, or if they're into sports, they're able to actually play sports without you having to drive 2 hours or something like that for them to do those things. So these are also important considerations. Then you've got property. So this is sort of like looking at the land or the house itself. So you're looking at things like zoning. So anyone that's sort of like thought about making a duplex or anything like that, you know that there's like R1, 2, 3. So councils have different regulations as well. Can you build a duplex on less than 15 meter frontage? There's all these considerations that happen to do with the plot size. Parking, so like my street, for example, is notoriously difficult to find parking in. I know other parts of Greenacre are similar because everyone's got a granny flat and you can't find street parking and all these other things. Density is another important consideration. So how many people live per square kilometre? The proximity to the CBD. Undoubtedly, the CBD is still the hub of a lot of employment. Obviously, there's Parramatta CBD as well. But the idea is that the more close you are to these places, the less likely you are having to commute long distances, etc. The other thing is that you want to be located far away from undesirable places. So like you don't want to be like your house isn't like above a pub or a prison or flight paths or all these other things that like at night you just keep hearing planes flying overhead and all these other things. So there's like these sort of considerations. Again, they're secondary, so they're only 10% of the weighting that I've done. And then you've got the people themselves. So like, again, two suburbs can be exactly the same, but the level of education, the careers, etc. And what's interesting is that a lot of people don't know that the ABS statistics actually provide all these details as well. Lastly, you've got the affordability aspect. So like either it's going to be within your budget or not. So like let's just say you do all this stuff and it spits out a particular suburb. So let's just say it spits out, I don't know, Sydney Olympic Park is the answer for you. Can you afford living in Sydney Olympic Park, like the Opal Tower or something like that? Like, I don't know, that's then a question of up to you. Then you would sort of like look at adjacent or cheaper suburbs. So yeah, that's the criteria. Are there any questions as I keep going? I'm going to try to finish off by 10 o'clock, so because I've got to pray. Okay, so I'll keep going. Now, how do you classify suburbs? So there's these quadrants that I've sort of made. Any like consultant person thinks of quadrants, generally speaking. So you're looking at two variables here. You're looking at deen and dunya. The important point to mention here is like dunya is all relative. So like when we're saying that one suburb is like better from a dunya perspective, you can't lose the sight that we're talking about like one of the best cities in the world to live in. Like if you compare this to like people in Syria and Palestine and all these other places that are sort of like really impacted by geopolitical issues, we should sort of keep that in mind, like take everything with a grain of salt. Like our existence here, even if it's in the worst suburb, is probably better than like 99% of the rest of the world. So like I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about this and sort of go like that. So you've got suburbs that are low. So like from a deen perspective, they're low. Jazakallah khair, Mohammed, for telling me there's no questions. I think there's a time lag as well, so I'm a bit ahead. But yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to put them down. So there's basically low. So deen is bad, dunya is bad. Then you've got high-low. So the idea here is that from a deen perspective, these suburbs are good. So I represented the low as an X because, like, why the heck would you live there? Obviously I'm being very thinking that, like, obviously if you can only afford that and stuff, like, I'm saying that's fine. But like if you've got the option, you wouldn't want to live there. Then you've got suburbs that have high deen and low dunya, relatively again. And I've represented this with a shield because you're protecting your kids' religiosity. Let me just move my head to the other side again. So like the shield, you're protecting your kids' religion. And then what you've got are suburbs that are low-high. So the idea here is that the deen is low, but from a dunya perspective, they're great. And I've represented that with an alien because your kids will be like whitewashed. If your kid's the only brown kid, your wife is the only hijabi, etc., etc., like you don't want to live in those suburbs. Like especially like think about like say you want your daughter to wear the hijab, inshallah. Like if the society or the suburb that you live in and the school that you send them to, they do not see any role models, they do not see that being a socially normal thing, the chances of them wearing the hijab are obviously lower than say someone that lives, like I'm being ceteris paribus here, like all other variables being exactly the same, you have that outcome. And then ideally what you want, the target that we want to hit is there's a suburb that's high in deen and high into from a dunya perspective as well. So I've put some examples of this, again no one get offended, but yeah, like there's no point of living in Young from that perspective. Like Young has that like I think one musalla masjid, and then like the percentage of Muslims there is quite low. When I look at the ABS statistics, I think it's about 4% or something like that. Just before someone bites my head off, let me just verify my points. Yes, 4.4% in Young, so it's like relatively low. And then you've got these suburbs here that I've put. They've got good religion relatively, but from a dunya perspective, they're a bit lower. So like again, the train infrastructure, the crime rates, etc., are pretty high, and all these other things. Then you've got these suburbs that are like really good from a dunya perspective. So everyone knows Point Pipe is like the most expensive suburb. It's got like the billionaire avenue or something like that, faces the water, harbour, etc. St. Ives is a really good one. So again, this is like a cluster where a lot of people from the Jewish faith live, and they've got one of the best primary schools, like St. Ives Public School, North St. Ives Public School. Look at them on the government website. These are phenomenal schools. Most of the kids meet their cutoff to get into James Lewis, even though it's a public school. So you're getting like top tier private school results at a affordable rate at these public schools. Again, because of the backgrounds of the people that live there and stuff. Then you've got Eastwood. So then there's a question mark as to what is the high suburb? Where are we actually trying to go? And like what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to break the link between there sort of being this deen dunya trade-off. So what I'm trying to say that as a parent, you're like I said, like you're trying to get into a really good suburb from like for your kids to get further in life from like a worldly perspective. But typically those suburbs are moved away from like where like they might preserve their Islamic identity and whatnot. So there's two ways. Where does Wollongong fit? Okay, very good question. So good, we're getting some engagement here. So if you look at the suburbs, I've put here Warrawong, for example. Warrawong and is an example of a suburb that is in Wollongong. I'm concerned that Wollongong is being read enough, whereas it just needs a good non-Salafi mosque to complete the rest suburbs. Yeah, very good consideration. So the idea here is that yes, there are particular places where a particular methodology, like say the Salafis or the Sufis or someone else, has sort of set up shop, and then like everyone's trying to break away. So like I know in Wollongong, for example, the non-Salafi crew are trying to now form their own musalla or masjid. I think there's a few Tabligis that have moved down there, for example, and other stuff. So the idea here is that it's not beyond the pale, but I guess it's, again, if we go back to the matrix and we sort of look at the criteria that I've sort of put, and you look at sort of other criteria. So if we took Warrawong as an example, and we looked at, for example, safety. So we looked at stuff like that. So Warrawong, for example, sits in Wollongong Council, and its incident rate of crime, for example, in 2021 was 21%, which is very high. So these are like crimes that are being reported. So last year, for example, there was a total of 900 incidents, close to 1,000 incidents that were reported, and the population size is about 4,500. So that's like a 20% incident rate, which is really high compared to like what else is out there. So yeah, yes, you can do it yourself if you want. Yeah, it's not a bad consideration if you want to do that. But yeah, like I'll come to how I sort of narrowed it down to 190 odd suburbs in a second. But basically, let's finish off this quadrant part. Basically, what I'm saying is that you're trying to find a high suburb, and there's only two ways that can be done, in my mind at least. What you have to do is go to a suburb that already has really good dunya and migrate. So similar to like the fact that, okay, our parents moved from those particular suburbs to here, the way that they, for example, they migrated, they improved our economic chances. They improved from a dunya perspective. So what I'm trying to say is that imagine a mini migration where you go, okay, get a bunch of Muslims, a bunch of families that are on the same page about this particular thing, and move into something like, I don't know, Sydney Olympic Park or Wentworth Point or Rhodes or something like that. So that's the idea. How do you take a group of people and move them there? The second method, which is much more difficult, I think, is gentrification. So the idea that there's a suburb that is already really good from an Islamic perspective, let's just say, I don't know, Auburn or Lakemba, and you sort of try to gentrify it. So you guys all move there, you guys all renovate the houses, you guys try to sort of like make the suburb a little bit more exclusive by moving a lot of educated people there. That's very, very difficult. Whereas if you already have a suburb that has educated people, really good infrastructure, hospitals, schools, etc., you can just move closer to those suburbs. And if you do this again en masse, you're not the only brown person there. You're not the only ethnic person there. Your wife isn't not the only hijabi there. So that's what I'm trying to talk about. I think what's more likely in terms of the 10-year plan is migration. And then obviously the property development idea that I sort of mentioned before. This is a bit boring, but I think it's important when we're sort of talking about units of analysis. So basically, if you look at the ABS, and I'll sort of jump out of the presentation and show you where you can access all this data from. So basically, the government sort of obviously divides. So there's an Office of Local Government, OLG. Basically, in New South Wales, there's about 4,500 suburbs. Then you've got like suburbs that have repeated names, like in case anyone's taking record, there's 178 suburbs that have 82 names that are repeated. So like the word Back Creek or Mayfield. Back Creek has like the 6 suburbs in New South Wales that have the word name Back Creek. I don't know why. Maybe there's a lot of creeks that have a back part to them or something like that. But then you've got 622 postcodes. So this is important. Postcodes are different to suburbs. Many postcodes will have multiple suburbs. So for example, 2190 is a postcode that's shared between Greenacre, Chullora and Mount Lewis. So like you have these postcodes that are shared. Another way of sort of dividing Sydney, because I guess the point of this slide is, how do you divide Sydney? And my short answer is suburbs. And the reason partly is because of the way that the data is structured. It's specific enough. And the second main reason is that when you look at property sites like Domain and all these other things, they're generally categorizing things based off suburbs, not postcodes. So suburbs are more specific than postcodes. If you look at LGAs, because this is important from like property development and all these other things, like each council has its own regulations and stuff, as well as like we also saw during COVID, like government policies can be at the LGA level. So like where people could travel, who couldn't travel, and that sort of reinforces that whole fact that Sydney's got 2 cities. There was one rule for like Southwest Sydney and there was a rule for everyone else. So LGAs are not without their own politics. So there's 130 LGAs, and typically in each LGA there's about 40 suburbs, if I'm not mistaken. And I guess another aspect is that some of them have larger contingents of suburbs, and some of them have like only one. So on average, a suburb, an LGA has about 40 suburbs. Median is 30, which indicates that there's some LGAs that have larger contingencies. I think the largest one that I came across is like the Mid-Coast thing. And like some LGAs only have one suburb, like Mossman and Broken Hill only have one suburb each. And like this is funny because in 2016, like when I'd go to UC on Parramatta Road, you'd see all these like protests and like these signs against the amalgamation of councils. So like in that 2016 reform, 39 councils became 19 councils. So there was like a decrease in the total number of LGAs. So for example, Canterbury Bankstown used to be 2 councils or 2 LGAs, and now Canterbury Bankstown is 1. We also saw, for example, like the Inner West Council LGA was like used to be, I think, Leichhardt and Balmain and some of those other areas, and I think like Ashfield, etc. They were all merged into one council. So that's like an important thing to just keep a track of mentally. So the ABS publishes its own way of standardization. So it's called the Statistical Geography Standard, and basically what they do is they sort of talk about how this is structured. And I've taken a photo of that on the right hand side. So you've got 2 types of structures. There's the ABS structures and there's the non-ABS structures. So non-ABS are things like electorates in federal and state elections and all these other things. And then what you've got are the ABS structures. So if we start at the bottom, so I'll move my mouse so people can maybe see it. I'm talking about this part here. A mesh block is like your basically immediate house and maybe 1 or 2 streets either way. And then you've got statistical area 1, which is about 200 to 800 dwellings. So a dwelling is just like a house or something like that, or like it could be multiple houses if it's a duplex or something like that. And then you've got what I've just highlighted there with the purple box is statistical area level 2. And this is like the significant urban areas, and this is basically a suburb. Basically what I'm trying to say is I've determined that the suburb is the unit of analysis, and to map that onto ABS data, we're talking about statistical area level 2. And then statistical area level 3 is a lot broader than that. So we're talking about over 100,000 dwellings, and then it obviously goes into state, and then states and territories, and then it goes into Australia. So sorry for that boring part, but it's just important to sort of understand what we're working with. People might say, why don't you analyze things at the local council level or the electorate level or other levels? And the reason is, as I said, like the suburb is the most specific way that you can get to answering these questions. Now, I've only got 10 minutes left because I think the Iqama is at 10 o'clock. So I want to probably be finished with a minute to spare or so I can make it on time. So we're looking at 21 LGAs that there are Muslims in. So what I did, just to I'll quickly speed this process up. The way that I got to this is I asked a group of friends in a WhatsApp thread, what percentage of Muslims need to be in your suburb for you to feel comfortable? And the answer was 10%. There's, as I said, like you can go on the ABS, for example, and you can just type in any suburb. So let's just go, I don't know, Lakemba is the example I'll quickly give. And I'll zoom in so everyone can hopefully see a little bit better. But literally you can go on the ABS website and look at suburbs, and you can see everything about these suburbs. And I use this for business reasons and other reasons. So you can see how many people there are, gender breakdown, age breakdown, Aboriginal to Indigenous to non-Indigenous breakdown, marriages, which schools people go to, the level of education, cultural diversity, where their parents were born, what languages they speak, the employment status, how many hours a week they work, what jobs do they work in, like how do they get to work, like do they drive a car or catch public transport, how many of them volunteer, health. So for example, I had a recent client who has a pharmacy, and what we did is we actually reviewed, okay, what are the most common illnesses that people in that particular suburb experience and all this other stuff. It was funny because I told him that they opened up in a healthy suburb. But like you can imagine, like if you're a psychologist, for example, you've got mental health as a category here. On average, about 9% of Australians, or just over 2.2 million people, have mental health issues, including depression or anxiety. And then what you can do is, like, if you're a psychologist, like if I ever finish off that qualification with postgrad stuff, I'd find the suburb that has the most people with mental health conditions and open an office there. So like you can build a lot of things out of this. Like if you're a mechanic, there's a section that tells you how many cars people have per house. So yeah, there's like a lot of information here, like even how many bedrooms people have, how many cars do they have, what type of household are they? So like are they a family? Mortgages, rent, and all these other things. So what I'm trying to say is that like you can like literally go at the suburb level. You can even go at the mesh level. So like you can actually zoom in and actually go more particular than what I've showed you. So I'm just going to quickly show you what I mean about how there's like different structures of data on this. So if I type in Bankstown, for example, you'll see Bankstown is a state electorate. It's a level 3. It's also an Indigenous area. Then statistical area 2 will cluster North and South Bankstown. And then you've got suburbs. So this is what I'm looking at. So if I go Bankstown, I'm not referring to all of these particular things. I'm referring to Bankstown as a suburb. So I'll click on that. So if I ever want to get the data of that. So what I then did is, because I knew that people wanted at least 10% Muslim, I used this thing, so that this data here is very fragmented. So it's not like, it won't show you 20 suburbs or all the suburbs in one table. Like I don't think you have to request access for those particular things. So what the SBS has done has like structured maps of Sydney. If you want to zoom out, they've structured Sydney based off 3 diversity markers. So they've got country of birth. So this is looking at ancestry. So like what countries people come from. Then they've got a section on languages that are spoken, and then they've got a section on religions that are practiced. So basically you can see like where the Muslims are. So this pink thing here, where all the Muslims are. And so what I did was I went through one by one, and I found basically 100 suburbs roughly that have at least 10% Muslims. So 1 in 10 people are Muslim. And then I also went to the level of 5% Muslim. And I've made this table here on the left-hand side just as an example. And what I've then done, just to quickly speed through this, I probably can't get through the Islamic schools part in this presentation. I might have to leave that for another day. But what I've done is, obviously Sydney is like Eastern Sydney, Western Sydney, like the Red Rooster line, because that's important as well from a property price perspective. Then what I've done is I've clustered. So I've put a dot. This took ages. I know anyone that's smart will tell me use Tableau or some other data visualization tool. They're very expensive, so I can't keep using trials. So what I've done is I've collated all the data into Excel sheets, and when the time is right, I'll probably put this in Tableau, and Tableau can make all the heat maps. But for now, I've just used Canva, and I've put dots. It took ages on all the suburbs based off how many Muslims live there by percentage. And then what I've done is I've drawn a ring fence around the suburbs that have at least 10% Muslims. And then you can see that there are like about 5 clusters, 2 big ones and 3 small ones. So just to go through them, you've got the Mount Druitt one. So this is around like Rudy Hill and all that stuff, all those like Islamic schools and mosques that are around there. Then you've got this, then you've got the East Lake Muslims, the Bengalis that I spoke about before. Then you've got the Shia in Arncliffe and Torella and that surrounding area. So obviously they've got the school, a few of their major places of worship, etc. around that area. And then you've got these 2 clusters. So either within the Muslim community, either you have to go into that sort of Bankstown, Cumberland, like LGAs, or you have to deal with like the Liverpool, Austral sort of area down to Minto and stuff like that. Then what I did is I added the 5% dots. I know there's a lot of these dots, but basically within the next census, potentially that orange box is obviously going to expand to encompass more of those suburbs. Then what I did is we're still looking at Islam. We're looking at like where are all like the concepts that are antithetical to Islam. So I think the concept that's most antithetical to Islam is obviously shirk. So what I did is I went on a lot of these like Hindu websites, Buddhist websites to find out where their temples are. I went on to like different articles that talk about LGBT lifestyles and like places like Newtown and all those other places like Woolloomooloo and all these other places that like really celebrate those things. So I've sort of mapped them with some orange dots. Then obviously there's not all Muslims on the same page. So you've got Sunnis and non-Sunnis. So I've put the non-Sunni groups and their places of worship and schools with light orange dots. So for example, as I said Arncliffe is Shia predominantly. And then I put Muslim schools with green dots and mega mosques with dark green dots. So as I said, like you want to live near a school, you don't want to live near a major mosque. And I guess the conclusions from this, you see misalignments within the area and outside the area. So what I've done is just go back. This central area here, because I'm not too fond of moving out west, this central area here, so the Bankstown, Cumberland is my focus for this. And you can see here that that orange line is still there. So then what I've done is then I've sort of zoomed into the map. So back here, we're looking at 21 LGAs, as it says on the top of the screen, that's a tracker, 196 suburbs across, and the zoom of the map, as you can see, that little scale in the bottom left is 2 kilometers. So that little scale is like to scale. And then when I've sort of said, okay, I don't care about Western Sydney, I don't care about Eastern Suburbs, etc., and I zoom in, this is sort of what we're left with. So we're left with 10 LGAs, 73 suburbs, and the zoom has increased twice, so that this zoom here is now 1 kilometer. So what I would say as the safe zones at the moment that I'm looking at, and I'll sort of end the presentation here, sorry to end on a cliffhanger, but the idea would be I'm looking at that sort of Auburn corridor. So you've got Al Faisal, Masjid al-Noor, you've got the Auburn Gallipoli Mosque, you've got Masjid al-Umar, for example, the new one that's been built. So those are the mega mosques over there. And then you've got the safe zones in sort of like Lakemba, Revesby. So you've got UMA, DIA, so that's Dar ibn Abbas, that's the UMA Centre, Lakemba Mosque, Masjid al-Sunnah, and then you've got all these Islamic schools here in Lakemba and so on and so forth. Just as a quick preview, I'll talk about Islamic schools, how they rank for NAPLAN, HSC results, and I've got this massive summary of like how they compare. But I'm going to end it there because I do need to go to pray, and I'll catch you guys next week.